What's going on, 3DMJers? We are back with another podcast episode. Today we're going to be talking about something that we have talked about before, but that we haven't really gone into the specific X's and O's of, and that is peak week, the actual peaking process for competitive physique athletes. You may recall the last time we talked about this, I had the pleasure and privilege of interviewing Dr. Joe Klimczewski about this, and we mostly focused on how some of his philosophies and our philosophies have changed, but specifically on the topic of manipulating carbohydrate, the difference between front loading versus kind of linear loading versus back loading. And there was probably some assumptions based upon your knowledge of those terms and that we were kind of already on the same page already, not a lot of background. And then we have also talked about identifying visually as a coach, the skill set of a bodybuilding coach, being able to tell when someone is spilled, full, and flat. But I think what we need is kind of a bit of a unifying episode where we really talk about what variables do we manipulate? On what theoretical grounds do we manipulate those variables? And what are we looking at to see what changes when we do that? And what do we base it on for the individual? So without further ado, I am pleased to say that I am joined by two of our head coaches, Brad Loomis and Alberto Nunez, who are maestros of the peaking. And we can discuss with them exactly what we've been doing, how we got here, and how it's changed over time. So, Berto, I'm going to kick it over to you. What are the main variables that you are manipulating, and what is your typical kind of default quote unquote setup for competitive for competitors during peak week, as far as what you're manipulating, why, and kind of where do you start?
I think priority one is just to end up on that stage looking fresh and not stressed and like you haven't been dieting for the last few months. So I think the safest way to get that done is going to be to start. Obviously, you're going to bring up food, right? Because part of the reason that we look the way we do on some days is because we've been chronically underfed. So, I think my most I guess safe bet, especially if I'm having a hard time figuring someone out, or sometimes you'll get an athlete that the way their body was responding to refeeds, weeks prior compared to now is just keeps changing. Usually a good week of pretty close to what is, or at about maintenance, is a good way to kind of just soothe that. So getting them on maintenance for about a week or so, anywhere between, I think 5 to 8 days is the usual. Along with that, bringing up their water intake a little bit. And this is something that I really started to pick on after seeing my powerlifters and how well they would respond to that when we would have them not just drink a little bit above their baseline, but have it like come in continuously. So those two things, and then the sodium is probably, I'd say, third place, probably a little bit more important the day of. You just need to have something that kind of resembles what they habitually have, maybe a little bit more, because it does help with carbohydrate absorption. But most of the time with peak weeks, I'm not trying to hit home runs. I'm just trying to have things look a little bit tighter than they were at their worst.
Gotcha. So to get that look, we're manipulating food, but what are the are we manipulating specific macronutrients? Are we manipulating, and you're manipulating water intake? What's kind of, or is it all relative to where their macros were, if you're even manipulating that, or what are we talking about here? Let's drill into some specifics.
Yeah, I usually pick on carbohydrates. Like that's usually what we use to get there. A little bit of extra dietary fat too to kind of facilitate, just make it more practical. I think the carbohydrates really also help with just having people get unstuck in regards to bowel movements. Like sometimes that's when people look their worst, and you see a lot of water retention, especially around the midsection when it's been like 4 or 5 days since they've actually gone. So yeah, I guess the most generic baseline sort of peak week, and this is usually something that I'll find myself doing with athletes that I haven't had a whole lot of tries with. It's going to be something conservative. Like, I'm not trying to hit home runs. It's like, this is what we look like, and I just want to have you have one of your better days when you are on that stage. Very similar to you hear this with powerlifters, that it's like whatever you were kind of training at your strength leading up to the meet, with a good peak, you might expect a 3 to 5% bump above where you were on average. And I'd say the same thing with bodybuilders, that typically, like, it's about a 3 to 5% increase, because those folks who they've done a good job getting into contest shape. They're lean. Even on those days where you see them bring out the camera, put it on their story that I'm so flat and I'm holding water. It's like, you look damn good still, So we're very limited in regards to like what we can do with a peak week. Like, a lot of it has to do with like what you were looking like prior to the start of that week. And dare I say, with some athletes, I'll even not really run a peak week, or make something that's super like short and abbreviated, because there is something about a peak week that just has people acting all differently all of a sudden. It's like, okay, so here's my peak week, and instead of being a week where we are having a lot of that stressful look kind of evaporate, like, they kind of make it worse. So sometimes with my newer athletes, I'll even do something where it's like, you know what, we'll just kind of have a little strategic refeed the 2 days prior. I won't even change up their training a whole lot, because again, it's more things that are changing and more things that can potentially put them on edge. But yeah, when it comes to the peak week, don't expect miracles. You can change the way you look significantly, but it's not going to happen with a standard peak week, and we'll get into that as we get deeper into this. But yeah, more than anything is like, whatever one of your better days is, like leaning those just random Wednesday where you're posing off like by the mirror and you're like, damn, I look pretty good. Like, that is usually as good as it can potentially get with a peak week, and trying to aim for something that is significantly better than that is probably gonna let you down just a little bit, and probably not something that you should even think about aiming for.
That's great. That's really helpful. So we know we're increasing food. We know that it's primarily carbohydrate. That can have some some secondary effects based on bowel movements and the water retention when you're constipated, which is unfortunately really common. And also, a lot of this has to do with thinking about where you have been, realistic expectations, and not shooting for the moon. If I'm reading between the lines, Berto, it sounds like while there may be a kind of higher end in most cases of improving your look 3 to 5%, getting this wrong, you have this asymmetrical potential of making yourself look worse. Like, you can definitely make yourself look 10, 20% worse.
Yes.
Attempting to get that 5%. So there's I guess a risk to reward consideration here as well, eh?
Yeah, and we've seen that. Like, I can't think of too many peak weeks where someone just really put it together. I think especially on the drug-free side, where it's like, whoa, well, that surprised me. You looked nothing like that, 7 days ago. But we have seen it go the other way, where we're thinking to ourselves like, what did you do to yourself in a week that just made months of work seemingly almost disappear?
Yeah, which is unfortunate. You hate to see it, and it is. Yeah, if someone was like, whoa, what happened? It's typically not.
Yes.
You look amazing. Why do you look like a brown paper bag instead of a muscular physique? So, yeah. Brad, anything you want to add to that, or things that maybe need to be clarified?
A few things. I think, first of all, one of the things that Berto kind of touched on, but that we really kind of get a little bit more into, is that, if you're not ridiculously lean, like yucky looking, it's probably not even worth running a peak week, because you're the 5% that you could get out of it is literally going to be like the planets aligning. And like you guys just said, you could do a whole lot of damage on how you look, you know. And so, and it's, you know, bodies are so different. You know, I just had a competitor that we peaked here a couple weeks ago. His upper body was absolutely shredded, you know, but he just tends to hold on to this very fine layer of fat, on his glutes and his hamstrings, you know. So there again, you know, is it really worth trying to knock it out of the park so that we can dial in his glutes and hamstrings when we could potentially really mess up what is his strength, and that's being that his upper body was just shredded. So, you know, we did something more conservative, and he placed very well. He placed, I think, 3rd out of 6, you know, in a pretty stacked show, you know, and we've got more work to do, and he's got more shows to do. But that's a good example of don't even really strategize too much unless you're just ridiculously yucky lean, you know. Just use what you know, you know, and what you've been experimenting with, you know, as you're leading into the show, and then just practice it, you know, practice it a couple of times. That's why I love getting ready early, you know, because you can get, you know, stack a couple of high days together, see what it looks like, see if there's much of a difference between a string of 5 low days and then a string of 3 low days and then 2 high days, you know. Are you pretty stable? Do you pretty much look the same, you know, regardless of having a couple stacked high days there? And then the last thing that Berto touched on that I don't think is talked about enough is just you can make your look terrible by stressing over it. And as Berto was talking, it reminded me, I just recently read something about phlebotomists and chasing veins. When people have, you know, usually pretty good veins and they need to get their blood work done, and they get sitting in that chair and they put their arm out and they freak out, and, you know, their veins just go away. And it's, there's probably evidence of it somewhere, but at least anecdotally, phlebotomists have noted that for years and years and years, how people's veins will just disappear when the people get nervous and scared and they start freaking out. And people will kind of do the same thing to the way their physique looks. You know, they'll stress out to the point to where it's like, I don't know what's wrong with me. Usually I'm vascular and veiny and, you know, I'm all full and striated and I didn't do anything different, you know. And it's like, dude, just take a breath, calm down, you know. And I think you can kind of ruin your peak by stressing, you know, too much. And that's why it's kind of nice to you know, go through it a couple times and know what to expect so that you can keep your athlete calm and keep them from, you know, that whatever that fight or flight syndrome is with our with our nervous system that makes those things kind of hide and go away.
That's interesting. You know, I was thinking, like, I wonder what the mechanism is there. Like, what physiologically is going on when your stress levels are higher? And, you know, we could theory craft, but I honestly don't know. I'm sure someone's
correct.
like, oh, it's definitely cortisol and then water retention. Like, yeah, maybe. I don't know. Like, it could be a lot of stuff going on. Changes in blood pressure. I have no idea.
Yeah,
but,
me neither.
Yeah, I mean, you also just, you know, you dump a bunch of glucose into your blood when you're stressed, you know? So I honestly don't know. But but that's something I've definitely noticed, is that more stressed athletes have less consistent looks on game day. And yeah, it's something where, you know, you start to notice it towards the end of prep if they're having a stressful prep, and then they look better when things are more normal in their life, and then game day comes up and then just, you know, just kind of crash and burn. So yeah, I'm not going to pretend as the science officer here to be like, oh, it's because of cortisol and water retention, but I'm also, that's what I sound like when I talk about science. I don't know if you guys noticed that.
yeah, definitely, yeah.
Yeah.
Your voice actually changes.
It does, yeah. That's the academic voice. You have to use that when you quote science. But anyway, it's something I've noticed when I was coaching athletes more often, and it's something that it's just so often anecdotally observed that there's got to be something to it. It might be helpful just to for maybe those who aren't fully all over this topic understand what the heck we're actually talking about. And I think a useful way to illustrate it is, why is it important to be really lean? And I think one way to describe what a better peaked body looks like is that all the little cuts and the little separation, all that just becomes more prominent when you're properly peaked. But it's not going to add like completely new lines. If you think about what is the process of peaking, it is consuming additional food so that you have more glycogen, you have hopefully normalized blood pressure, you have a better electrolyte balance, so that things are in better proportion to one another in terms of just looking like they have their normal shape. And then we actually do have, I'm not going to do the science for us again. Sorry, guys. We actually do have some science that now these days we're relatively confident that carb loading does actually improve physical appearance. So there was a cool study that came out in 2019 by Desmarais, and this is a hard thing to study, to actually have like a comparative trial. So what this was what you would call a quasi-experimental design. So they took they took a bunch of different bodybuilders and they asked them what they did, and they broke them into two different quote unquote experimental groups because they weren't actually experimenting. They weren't modifying what they did. And they had those who carb loaded and those who did not based on what they said. And we're basically comparing an average of like 5 grams per kg of carbohydrate in a given day versus like 10 grams per kg. So like a really high carb intake. So that's, like if we're talking a 180 pound competitor, that's like 800 grams of carbs on one day. So it's big time carb loading. And what they did was that they used silhouette photos of these athletes and showed them to bodybuilding judges, and they gauged, like, rated who looked better. And the silhouettes of the athletes who'd carb loaded were rated higher, so they looked more muscular. So the idea here, okay, we store glycogen in muscle, and that is actually going to affect the geometry of our muscle, right? So this is something that bodybuilders have known anecdotally, or reported anecdotally, I should say, and that is probably the case now. We don't have a lot more than that in terms of the science. We know what bodybuilders do. We know the theory behind it. So this is not one of those episodes where the coaches share their things and I go, hey, here's the science that backs it up. Much more than this. This is something that is definitely an art and that should be individualized. And we are making a lot of guesswork. But I think what we think is happening when someone looks worse from the peaking process is typically on two ends of the spectrum. They're either being super over aggressive, and they are actually what's called spilling over. So they're trying to store more carbohydrate than they can fit into their muscle glycogen. And that comes with changes in the water balance and a worse overall look. You might look big. Your silhouette might look better, which is one weakness of that study, but you don't have that same separation. So you actually look less lean, even though you've gotten larger. On the other end of the spectrum, if you're someone who is trying to do that last minute dash to the stage to get a little leaner, and you end up being too depleted and you either can't correct it, or you just come depleted all the way into the show because you're maybe too focused on the lines, then you are so flat, your muscles are so depleted of glycogen that they don't stretch the skin in the same way, and you actually don't look as lean or big. So yeah, both are outcomes you don't really want. And that's what we think is happening. So to go back to Brad's example of a competitor who's looking great in the upper body, great from the front, but just has a little layer of fat, covering the glutes and hams. And if you're the coach and you're noticing that, their glutes and hams still need to come in even after or on the day or after 2 days of refeeds, you should realistically not expect that to change with the peak because you're not modifying the body fat. And what Brad was saying is that, trying to diet in a week off a layer of fat on the glutes and hams is not going to be that successful. You'll lose a little bit, but it will definitely reduce that fullness in the upper body, and the overall quality of the physique could be worse instead of just going, hey, let's lock in the level of leanness that we have now and let's make the most out of it, which is what Brad did and probably resulted in him placing 3 out of 6, not 4 out of 6 or something like that. So hopefully that clarifies to the listener what exactly we're talking about. So from here, unless there's something you guys want to add, what I want to ask about is how do you know like where to start with an athlete? Like, do we just give them X amount of grams per kg, or is there the magic peaking numbers? Or what day do you start the peak week on? Like, where do you establish the baseline for a given competitor, and how do you know where to adjust from?
Yeah, since we started using the multiple day refeeds a little bit more commonly, that's what they ended up being, kind of a crystal ball, so that we have some information to base things out of. I think in the past, prior to that, a lot of what we did was just what kind of made sense based off their usual carb intake, the size of the athlete. Whereas with 2 to 3 consecutive days of eating at maintenance, which is not uncommon for a lot of our athletes, you get a good idea of what happens, and they're able to relay information to you. And you can see how that even changes over time, where, maybe if they had 3 consecutive refeeds at first, by the time they got to the third day, they started to maybe like really fade away a little bit, like they were overcarbed. And you might find that like later on, it's gotten to the point where it's like, shoot, now they're so depleted that if anything, it might not seem like it's enough, and you might have to tack on like a fourth high-ish day. So a lot of the clues are there, and I think this really helps the athlete get it, that or be able to comprehend that, we're not changing a whole lot. You're not entering into the unknown. We've kind of done this the whole way, and we're going to kind of just try to repeat what's been most recently happening. So I think that's really gone a long way in helping like me as a coach with the anxiety that comes with a peak week, and most importantly, the athlete, as we discussed, it can, an anxious athlete can like totally change the way they look and how they respond and how predictable they are. So yeah, the clues are there the whole way, and it's important that we use them, and it's important that we really teach the athlete to relay what they are seeing, because quite often, like, that is what we're going to count on, like on that peak week, is like your athlete being able to really communicate with you, like what is going on, like right now, how do things feel, where do you think it's going? Like with my more experienced athletes, I love the fact that I have the luxury to ask them, okay, what do you think we should do? What do you think is going to happen? But yeah, it helps now that, in the past, like we had like the practices, the peak weeks were like either we got there early and we got to practice a few peak weeks, but usually it was whatever we had that season. Say it was 3 shows. It's like, okay, we have these 3 practice runs, and in 2-3 years when we do this again, we'll try to remember that and apply it. Whereas now it's like, hey, like all these weeks that we're dieting, they offer many previews in regards to how your body might respond to fluctuating caloric intakes.
Mm.
Yeah, and Eric, you asked a little bit about the numbers. A lot of times, I just kind of will manipulate the macronutrients within the calories that we have planned for their high days. Because a lot of times when I'm planning a deficit for somebody, I'm thinking weekly deficit. If I want to lose a pound a week, I'm planning a 3,500 calorie per week deficit. And then I'll get my calories arranged on each day, depending on how many high days and low days I want. And then when we're practicing, I'll say, okay, well, normally, say the high day is 2,800 calories, and normally it's 65 grams of fat and 275 grams of carbs and, whatever protein, kind of mix it up. Let's keep the same caloric amount, but let's just go down a little bit in fat, give you a little bit more carbohydrate, kind of see what that looks like. And then, the next time that we have, our high day scheduled or a double high day or whatever, well, let's play with it a little bit more, let's go a little bit lower in fat and get in a little bit more carbohydrate, and then maybe kind of start playing around with, okay, you know what, right, this will be something that we'll get into, but let's see, your blood pressure is pretty low, you feel like you're going to pass out after you tie your shoe, you get that vasovagal response, and it's just because you probably have chronically low blood pressure. So this time around, let's give you this much carbohydrate, this much fat. When you take your pictures, give me just a little bolus of some salt water. Take a little half teaspoon of salt and dump it in your water, drink it down, get a pump up, and then take your pictures, and let's see what things look like, because that will increase blood pressure, at least, what do they call that when it's very short-lived, like a transient, kind of short-lived effect. And let's see if we get anything out of that, But as far as the numbers go, I don't like to interfere with my fat loss that's going on. So I'll just kind of keep the same calories and mix and match the carbohydrate and the fat and maybe sometimes the protein, just to maximize the carbs that we can get. See if we do see that silhouette look, a little bit more pronounced, and the little lines be a little bit more defined compared to what we normally have been seeing.
That's really helpful, guys. So, I mean, I think the listener is now going to understand, okay, so the paradigm which we're operating under is that we have low days and high days, right? Which I think is an often unsung hero of the refeed protocols that we use. We've definitely talked about here and on other podcasts. Myself and Alberto have been on to talk about this, that, we have these anecdotal experiences with, refeeding diet breaks, and those are somewhat matched in some of the research findings we have, but we don't have any data on bodybuilders. We have, some data out of Bill Campbell's lab that suggests maybe there's some slightly better, muscle retention utilizing refeeds, even when total calories are matched, in relatively lean, pretty trained people. And then we have some data that Jackson Pios was a part of on diet breaks, where comparing same net total deficit but greater amount of time, where you're coming in and out of these every other week kind of setup, or every third week setup of having a week in maintenance. And we don't see much of a physiological difference in terms of body comp, but we do see things that you think would improve adherence. So lower markers for hunger, greater diet acceptability, stuff like that. And that's, those are interesting pieces of the puzzle, and that's pretty important, the psychological side. And I really hope that in the future we can get this in more replicable or representative populations that are compared to bodybuilders. But anyway, anecdotally, it certainly seems to be something that improves the overall contest prep outcome. Could be down entirely to psychology, could be a mix of both. We don't know. But one benefit, like I was saying, that's kind of often not discussed when you're looking at it from a scientific lens, is that when you have the opportunity to go high in high in calories, you have the opportunity to go high in carbohydrate. And if, let's say, you have 3 or 2 refeed days in a week, you got 4 or 5 low days, you can also change the distribution of those days. So you could hey, let's, you report to me on Sundays. I want to see what that morning report looks like after we do a Friday, Saturday refeed this week, instead of our normal, Monday and Thursday, which are your 2 lower body days, or what have you. And we're also going to do it on a deload, so that your overall output's a little bit lower. So you can stay within the confines of, like Brad was saying, the fat loss plan, and not impede it when you're looking at it at a macro level at the total deficit over the week, and still getting the job done, not messing with your cardio and your training or your overall energy balance too much, but getting those visual cues. And you can get an idea. And you don't even have to just wait till the report comes. One thing I would often do is, once I think we're within striking range of being lean enough to notice these details from peaking, is I would start to make those manipulations and be like, hey, send me pictures from the morning and the evening of each of the days that you're refeeding on, and then the morning and the evening after. Because sometimes there is a lag before you start to see these visual changes. And you might have the right numbers for someone to make them look good, but they look worse first and then look better. This is something that Cliff Wilson calls the load look,
Yeah.
Like, it takes some time for that glycogen to get where it needs to be. It takes some time for that water balance to renormalize, and that time course may be different for different people. So yeah, I think that's those are all things you can do, and then you don't have to sacrifice dieting weeks. Because, Berta, you sort of alluded to this, and I'd love to hear you talk about it a little bit more, is that the ideal situation is you're getting multiple weeks of potentially coming out of the same size deficit, or quote unquote eating up into a show. So I'd like to hear a little more on that. But the last point I want to clarify is just that this is all based upon what they've been doing leading up to it. And like Berto was saying, it's not just, I got 3 shows, so I got 3 chances to get it right. It is from the point where I'm lean enough for that to be reasonably representative for kind of labbing this out. We are doing that, and we're using that refeed schedule to inform what we do with that peak week. So anyway, with that preamble, Berto, I'd love to have you expand a little bit more on the concept of maybe getting ready early enough to be able to feed up into the show.
Yeah. Because, again, when we're peaking, it's like what we got's what we got, right? It's like your best days, like that's kind of sort of what we're going to try to replicate on that stage. Like, we shouldn't expect much more than that, right? So with... Then honestly, I think this is something that is so worth it that I will strongly encourage my athletes to, hey, let's try to make it so that we have enough time so that we're ready, and we have anywhere between 4 to 8 weeks of eating up before we hit our stringer of shows. This is the one form of peaking where you can definitely see more than a 5% increase. You will have some people who actually gain kilos of body weight, yet they're tighter. And the best part is that a lot of those days that you have where you look not so good, it just becomes less and less of a thing. Anyone who's experienced this will tell you that, hey, it's like I wake up every day and it's like, shoot, I can compete, Monday at 11 in the morning. I can compete Thursday at 3 in the morning. I'm just always looking like the way I like to look. But again, you need to give yourself enough time for this to happen. The way you would do it is you get to the desired shape that you want, and then from there, you slowly start to increase calories until we're running around at I guess you could call it a pseudo maintenance in a way, right? Because we are being conservative with it. Like, we don't want to go too far and then have to induce like another fat loss phase, because getting shredded once is hard. Doing it twice in a prep, it's going to be hard to convince someone to do that. But yeah, we do it carefully and in small increments, and we try to find that sweet spot. And then it gets to the point where, hey, the peak week rolls around, and all we're really watching for is making sure, like, hey, we have our water, at a good, consistent place. We have all the foods that we can digest well. And it tends to be really low stress, since again, like, the athletes seeing themselves like look great every single day of the week, that it just makes peak week less of a mystery. They know exactly what they're going to look like, and it's a lot easier to just maintain something that you already rocking, as opposed to like searching for that look and trying to time it so that it lands on show day. But with this sort of format, like, if we're talking percentages, I'd say the worst responders can maybe expect 5%. Whereas, man, like the people who really, really respond well, I'd say somewhere around like 15% of a difference. And that's enough to like knock you up a few places. That's enough to where even, I don't know, your friends that are, just kind of lay fans because you do it, like, they might see you one week compared to another week in clothes, and they're like, wow, like, you look big and alive and healthy and just overall like less beat up. It's that obvious in most cases.
We just released 4 new hypertrophy videos and 4 new contest prep videos to the 3DMJ Vault. In the hypertrophy Q&A collection, we'll cover how to allocate compound versus isolation volume, how to return from injury, protein intake requirements for maximum growth, and whether or not overhead pressing can be replaced by lateral raises. In the contest prep Q&A collection, we've added content about how to coach yourself through a prep, using body measurements, decreased food variety, whether or not you need to change your training when you start prep, and how many days a week you should train during prep. You'll also get all new text-based summary and notes sections throughout the new Lagging Body Parts video course. All this is included free at no extra cost in your Vault VIP subscription. Visit 3dmjvault.com to become a member today.
Is it worthwhile for me to do a case study experience of Eric Helms 2019?
Oh yeah, that's yeah, absolutely.
I'd say I was
that
like
one
kind of
really well. That one really well.
I would say I wasn't a low responder, but I don't think I was a extreme responder either. But so yeah, I did. Just for context, I competed in mid-April after dieting from end of December till that point, and I was in legal shredded condition, as we like to call it here at 3DMJ. Yeah. I had a couple dents in my glutes, hamstring separation, and everything else, but I wasn't yucky, as Brad had called it, quite yet. And once I did that, and so that was great, because I had a couple of weeks of trialing the peak week, and I did not eat up into the April show. In fact, I went a couple of weeks without refeeds to just try to get a little more off, and then we utilized that schedule. And it was exactly the same as my refeed plus like one extra day of eating, basically, if I recall correctly. And then came into that show. I looked as good as I had up to that point, I would say. You know, I looked kind of like just a full day for me. And then we got nasty for essentially all of May, like 6 weeks after that, I want to say. And we got down to, I was probably dieting on 1,800 to 2,000 calories, and I got down to like 1,600 to 1,800 calories. And a lot of that was just removing the high days until Berto thought I was either going to, it was detrimental or I had got where I needed to be. So they got less frequent to increase that net deficit. And then basically from June until August, I was just eating up, and we were just incrementally bumping things up. And I went from that low place of, like I said, 1,600 to 1,800 calories a day to fluctuating between 2,400 to 2,800 calories a day, and weight stabilized right around 80 kilos. And yeah, I remember the things I used to text Berto just to kind of agree with what he was saying was, put me in, coach. I'd send him a video and I'd say, put me in, coach. Like Random Tuesday, I'm ready to rock. I look like I want to on stage. I'm solid.
Yeah.
Just throw some Dream Tan on me. And that was a very comfortable place. Well, as comfortable as you can get when you're uncomfortable, because you feel terrible. But it was emotionally much less stressful than prior years, where I was like checking the clock last minute, like how much more time do I have to get on stage because I need to look a little better. So yeah, that was exactly my experience. And that was primarily just us increasing carbs, like 50 grams a week for multiple weeks on end.
Yeah. And like you said, it's just, to an athlete, just knowing what's going to show up on the other end is just so much more comforting. Because for better or for worse, man, like peak weeks are supposed to be de-stressing, but they're stressful. It's to the point where I remember for big shows, I used to write up these big peak weeks. I'm like, we're going to start peaking 12 days out because this is a big deal. This is your last show. And to be honest, I think it did them a disservice, if anything, because now for 12 days, like they're like, I am peaking, like if my basement floods, like it's ruined, right? So it has them on edge for a long period of time. Whereas like with this, I mean, the edge was just, hey, make sure you wake up on time and just make sure you have enough water on show day and enough sodium, and you didn't even have to eat a whole lot on show days. I mean, that's one thing we've done a little differently with peaks of late, but even more so the case. It's like you woke up, got your water in, and you looked as fantastic as like the Friday before, the Thursday before, the Wednesday. And it's just nice to know that, hey, this is just what I look like now, as opposed to, trying to, chase that unicorn.
Yeah. The only question we had was, do we skip the meal before you get on stage, or do we have it?
Yeah.
Because it might make a small transient difference in the pump. But I was topped off, and I had been for weeks. So it was it was a good position to be in. And yeah, I would say that the Mayhem was the best I'd ever looked on stage and in that prep. So that's an example of we weren't even necessarily limited to that, hey, random Tuesday look anymore because of that. We were in a position where we could reliably take a physique that had improved from before and get a little more on top of that, which is cool. And yeah, like I've had the opportunity to do that. I think I did a really good job with that. Shout out to Mark Spinks, who did a series of shows at the same time. He dieted while his coach was dieting, and both of us were walking around shredded. And hopefully, I didn't screw up the job too much because I was half dead. But no, he very much replicated my experience, just with an extra 100 grams of carbs. He was running around like 400 grams a day because he gets to. But anyway, and it was the same kind of thing. We were just able to keep a very, very consistent, peaked, shredded look. So it's definitely something that I think is our ideal scenario. But I think the question is what needs to be done to put someone in that position? So Brad, how often do you get to do that? What are the barriers? Is it something a first timer should expect? Can you plan for it? Or is eating up into a show maybe a little more challenging in most cases from a logistical and practical perspective?
Well, eating into a show is definitely good for like Berto said, that look of not looking like you look like that haggard person that's been up all night drinking, and now I've got to show up for the wedding and get pictures, you don't want that look, which is sometimes, what we kind of look like after a competition prep. So when you can eat up into a show, I think that's the biggest thing, is you don't look like you've been up all night drinking, for the wedding photos,
I love the analogies you guys use. Like Berto's like, you look like you got jumped in an alley, and you're like, you look like you did a bender on wedding day.
I like this one more. I think I'm gonna start using that one.
That's good.
But I mean, it definitely is true. You look healthier. When you get to eat up into that. And so, when does that happen? Well, us as coaches, we like it to happen more often than not. But a lot of times when we see the look that we want, or let's say that we've overshot it a little bit. We thought we were going to be shredded at 169 pounds. We're pretty shredded at 169 pounds, and through eating up into the show, we continue to lose weight. Now we're 166 pounds. And then it's kind of like, well, now you know what? I don't want to get any lower. I don't think we need to push for any lower. If it happens, it happens. But let's let food continue to come up here. Because even you mentioned, Eric, earlier that you were going to fluctuate between 24 and 28. And, somebody like that, 24, 28, that still might be a deficit for some people that we're kind of searching for, right? So we just continue to incrementally bring up food. And if weight loss happens, it happens. But at least we're not forcing it. We're not cutting calories to make weight loss happen. I think that's a real important, kind of a distinguishing thing that we want to make sure we kind of touch on too, real briefly. And so then, the look gets more and more and more stable. And then sometimes you don't really even need a peak week at that point. You might just throw in some extra carbohydrates the night before, maybe get them looking a little bit, quote unquote, spilled. And then the day of the show, you're just doing some very light eating, water, staying off your feet, kind of being calm. That to me is kind of like the ideal peak week, when we've been increasing food to stop weight from coming off. Maybe what was the diet break macros are now kind of the diet macros, right? And that a lot of times does happen when you kind of meet what we project, quote unquote, I'm doing it with my fingers, what the goal weight would be. It kind of coincides with the look that we're after, and we decide, okay, you know what? Let's not push for any further weight loss. Let's let food kind of come up here, and if it happens, it happens. But we're not going to force it to happen. And sometimes we got to do this just for the psychological aspects of the athlete. Maybe we haven't got the look that we're after, but we can't continue to subject this person to the lifestyle that they've been living. And so we're just going to say, you know what? We've got what we've got. You've worked hard for this. Yes, we're not shredded. Maybe we don't have enough muscle to be shredded, and we got to kind of think about that in the off season. But just for the psychological reasons, we need to start bringing food up now at this point. And it's kind of the same thing. We're not really going to quote unquote peak. We're just going to get up there in a healthy state and show off your hard work, and then let the judges decide whatever it is that they're going to decide with the placing. But, I kind of hope that I answered your question there, Eric, because it's ideal, but it doesn't always, happen for reasons that I just kind of touched on.
Well, I think some of the things you said are really helpful, because I think sometimes people have in their mind, like, you only get to eat up if you are just diced out of your socks, and then you get to do it. And I think for most bodybuilders, physique athletes in general, well, bodybuilders specifically in their division, like, you always think I can get a little bit leaner. So a lot of people don't ever allow themselves the opportunity to eat up. And it is a bit of a subjective call. And I think you're not just eating, like everyone has their, and this is something I think coaching is so important for. I haven't even said what it is yet, but their point of calling uncle. And when you don't acknowledge it, it's just as much a problem as when you do. I think the kind of default position we have as hardcore bodybuilders is it's kind of weak to be like, if we keep pushing me, something else is going to go. Like it's going to mess up my relationships. I'll be just too tired. I'm worried about my health, or I'll binge, and those are all going to be very individual for the person. So I think a real mature bodybuilder can let the coach know, I don't think I can push any harder than this. This is we're about at my breaking point. And at that point, like, you would increase food anyway. You know what I'm saying? So, and you're just simply not going to try to get leaner. So knowing when that point is psychologically for the athlete and then eating up from there, it will only improve things. But if you push them past it, then sometimes you can't eat them up because they start binging, or they quit, or they drop out, or they make some very strange life decisions, which they'll regret in a year, because you kind of lose your shit. And I've seen all of those things happen. So, yeah, I think what the difference between an experienced and less experienced bodybuilder is that point of calling uncle gets pushed back with experience. And of course, the first time you do it, it's going to be much more related to just your natural personality and your natural physiology. So I remember in 2007 when I dieted myself, I got like decently lean, but that I definitely hit my uncle point. And then in 2009, I pushed I killed myself to get shredded. And then 2011, it was easy to get to that same level of conditioning. And then, 2019, I did have discussions with Berto about I think this is the time now I want to push. I don't think I can handle pushing from now all the way through there and doing it slower. So let's suboptimally decide to make this deficit too large. So if you were freaking out earlier and you're like, well, you were on 1,600 calories. Yeah, that was a calculated decision, because I was noticing that I was getting fatigued by the presence of being in a deficit rather than the magnitude of it. And I was like, you know what? I just need to, we need to get the dirty work done. And then we'll just have a longer kind of tail end, and we'll correct the excessive damage we're doing now instead of just kind of slowly chipping off this bit of fat. So that's the type of thing where it needs to get individualized. But I do think in probably most cases, unless someone just doesn't give you enough time, there should be eating up. And that might be a decision that's not related to peaking, even though it will make them look better. Did I summarize that pretty well, guys?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
No, with every prep, your ability to cope and create strategies, it's just going to get better and better. And if you, like you said, if you don't pull out, sometimes when it comes to the final, you just might make it worse, because continuing to strip down fat in that state of mind that you might be in might put us in a hole that it's I don't think there's a peak week that's going to be able to fix this thing. And so sometimes the best answer is okay, maybe said bodybuilder didn't get to, they barely missed single digit body fat. But sometimes having you eat up is going to yield a look that is just better overall, instead of being at single digits. But we're constipated, we're stressed, we don't fill out in a predictable way. I'd much rather take the more complete look that maybe even over the long term did less to you in regards to the psychological trauma, so that next prep you can build off this and go even further. Because, man, sometimes it's not even that the person can't, maybe they have all their soldiers in order in their head, but their body's doing something completely different. I think all of us here will can agree that with every prep, it's it takes away a little bit less from you. I think because your body's been down this road, it's okay, no need to panic. We do this every once in a while. Everything will be okay eventually. So sometimes your mind can be right, but your body's just doing all sorts of funky things. I think, honestly, the most taxing prep for me physically ever was my first prep, and I didn't even get lean. And a lot of that had to do with just that constant state of stress that I was living under for a full 6 months.
Yeah, and that does have knock-on effects on the way you look, to bring it back to our topic. So, yeah, I think just understanding there is a point, and I think that where you shouldn't push it further, even if it would even make you leaner, necessarily wouldn't make you look better, or it might hurt your overall long-term career. And you kind of have to just kind of consider all that. And we can't tell you what the correct answer is there, but that is definitely something to be aware of. And sometimes the kind of the default mentality of bodybuilders gets in the way of even being able to have this conversation. Like you'd think that all bodybuilders would have a very heavy growth mindset. Like whatever my qualities are right now, I can improve upon that. I am not a fixed thing. And it's kind of intrinsic to the idea of bodybuilding. But the one place, ironically, that I find bodybuilders don't have that is willpower.
Yes.
Right? So all bodybuilders, not all, but a large preponderance of them, the way they self-identify is still being like an athlete and a champion when they don't necessarily have the physique of a champion yet is, well, that's fine. Like, I know I'm not the biggest, I know I'm not the leanest, but I can grind myself into dirt. I got that underdog mentality. So if anything chips away at that, it's like I have nothing left. Like if I am, maybe I don't have what it takes to push myself to the level of leanness I should be, and I don't have a good physique. No, I can't be that person. So I need to always be the person with all the most willpower ever. Instead of having a perspective of, I obviously got pretty ridiculous willpower. I'm competing in a bodybuilding show. This is less than 1% of 1% of athletes who even think that's a reasonable thing to do. And of them, they're wrong. It's not reasonable, but we do it anyway. So don't worry, you're already in the willpower club. But then to just acknowledge that you can actually improve your willpower over time. And you can, like Berto was saying, the same experience can be experienced as less traumatic. And that's a good thing, because if you traumatize yourself to get really, really lean, it makes the next prep potentially even harder if it even happens. Yes. So, yeah. So anyway, that's a bit of a psychological detour, but I think it's an important one, because it's speaking from the coach's perspective, if I have an athlete who will push themselves further than I think they should, and they won't be honest with me about that, I know that it's going to eventually harm their outcome. And I bear some responsibility there. So I try to have conversations like these and share that perspective and make it an environment where it's okay to maybe not be the god of willpower, right now, and try to help them kind of look at that as you don't have a growth mindset here. That's kind of against your whole philosophy. And maybe we want to line that up. And maybe it's okay to be a more willful bodybuilder or have more grit next time. And grit is something we can work on, and that's okay. But if we try to short circuit and just pretend we're grittier than we are now, you're just going to get ground into dust. So hard conversation to have, and but I think it's a really important one when we're talking about what are your limits, which is ultimately what we're trying to peak.
Well, if we don't have that, I mean, if we're speaking about peaking, like there's also ways where we discuss, like there's de-peaking, right? And this is one way where in that prep, because you decide to continue pushing, you aren't going to have the best physique you can have. And then in the long term, it's like, man, your full potential, your ceiling, like that's going to be down a few notches because you're being a little hard-headed in regards to, hey, like let's let this one go and reformulate from here our next strategy. But you're right. I mean, even for me, dude, I think that's probably you can tell me my calves like, you can tell me my arms are this, but the work ethic is probably the one thing that, it's like I carry here. And if it were to come up short, and it has, and I've had those discussions with myself, but they weren't easy ones, man, to say that, okay, I think you've had enough of this for one sitting.
Yeah. No bodybuilder wants to be like, I don't want to work harder than this. Like you can't admit that's like you're saying, my soul is actually a traitor to me as a bodybuilder. I am not who I believe to be. So like, yeah, it's that kind of brutal self-honesty that I think is really important. And yeah, it's maybe a little easier with a coach, I think.
Yeah,
I think that's an important key piece of it. So I'm going to throw some. These won't be curveballs for you guys. They'll be easy to answer, but some of the less than stock standard approaches that I sometimes see people use out there, like for example, electrolyte manipulation, potentially cutting water or drinking a lot more water, fat loading, or specific foods. Talk to me. Is there any voodoo that you do or that you want to talk about? Or I mean, because obviously, if we were just to talk about like what are all the things that bodybuilders do, for peak week, it's a laundry list of things we'd recommend against. But it's not to say that we don't manipulate any of this stuff. Like Brad, you were mentioning salt water to try to manipulate blood pressure, to try to enhance fullness in the pump. Anything else? Let's open floor it.
I've got a few, I guess, non-standard things that I've done before. I mentioned earlier how stress can really throw a curveball, into your peak and your look, right? And so on more than one occasion, I've sent an athlete out to dinner. I said, you know what? We're looking really good here. I want you to go out. I want you to have a nice steak with some steamed vegetables, and I want you to have a glass of wine. You know what? Let's have 2 glasses of wine. And they get all chilled out, and they're really relaxed, and sometimes that alone will be just what they need to have a few hours of just decompression right before this big day that they're going to have, and kind of cause maybe a little bit of introspection of like, you know what, this is a big day. I need to enjoy this day, and sometimes just those few hours of decompressing and just relaxing is all that they really need. Did it help? They peaked good. I can't say that they would not have looked that good, but at the same time, it helped them to enjoy their experience more, than anything. And I mean, steak and veggies, there's no carbs in that. I don't really have to worry about having them spill, a little bit of carbohydrate and a little bit of red wine. There's not really enough there, make sure they drink their water. And, that's a safe move in my opinion, So yeah, that's kind of one of the more unconventional things that I've done for, a peak week, especially for people that are really stressing over their show and all the anxiety that goes along with it.
Hey, you got to be careful when you drink when you're dieted, because a little bit goes a long way.
It does.
Bro,
You're right.
2 glasses of wine when I'm shredded, that's not relaxed, Brad. that's drunk. So,
well, yeah, I'm definitely not going to recommend 2 glasses of wine for your 100 and, the guy that I just had compete 2 weeks ago, he was 136 pounds,
Mm-hmm.
Bro, let's not have two glasses of wine there. Let's have just, a little couple swallows.
Skoosh. All right. So Brad's getting people drunk out here. What about you, Berto?
I think kind of similar to him in that, like, sometimes, well, I'm sure just hearing that from your coach, like, hey, you know what, today, this very arbitrary to-do list that I created is like, I almost see it as magic, even though we teach them not to. It's like, okay, if coach says so, I'm going to do it. I'm going to enjoy myself. And they're legit in I guess, in that moment. You don't get too many of those when you're prepping. So sometimes just creating a nice environment for them that just makes it less stressful is like, I've had a girl, she looked tremendous. Like she was prepping for a meet. So I'm like, you know what? We're going to squat heavy the day before. It never really did anything to the appearance of her legs. So she did that, and she looked marvelous on that stage. So sometimes, yeah, just playing off things that are going to make them feel better. A big one that I do often is, especially when we're not all the way there yet, it kind of got caught off guard. We still need a few more weeks to, get a little closer to 100%. It's, again, just that shorter peak week. It's like, hey, you know what? Normal week, and then you wake up Wednesday, you wake up Thursday, and that's when the peak week starts. And I think sometimes just because it is a very tense environment when you are peaking. I think that's been a huge one for me. Mm-hmm. And shoot, I think outside of that, I've seen some changes, like with upping dietary fat. I think it works well on some people, not so much on others. Conveniently, like quite often, I want Friday to be the day we get the look. So sometimes if we get the look, it's like, all right, you know what, we'll bring down carbs just a little bit. We'll kind of hold it with a little extra dietary fat. And sometimes it works well for folks. Sometimes it doesn't. Usually it's one of those things that I'd rather find out with filling out via fat, the intramuscular fat, just with like the post-show eats. It's like, hey, you get your burger and if you feel like, it did a little something, like for example, with me, I do feel like there's a little something there that I do get, but it's not nowhere near carb fullness. It's like maybe a little bit in certain areas. But you know what? I think the biggest like new thing I've done is just keeping that water consistent, because water is something that your body keeps track of like quite closely, because like think about it, we can go days without eating, but drinking not so much. So if there is a time to kind of like really sit by that water jug that the mean bodybuilder carries, it's probably during peak week, where I'm like, hey, you know what? Like if this has worked really well with my powerlifters. I want you to just keep chugging that water. Try not to go an hour without having some water in when you're awake. And yeah, it's annoying because you're peeing all the time, but hey, that's a good sign. That means that, hey, we're probably not going to be holding any water. So sometimes, especially with those athletes who, what makes them fluctuate isn't necessarily like, like, are you spilled? Are you this? But it's just water retention issues. Having them up their water by, just so we feel like we're being proactive, I'll do like 25-ish%, maybe like a third above what we're usually drinking, and just making sure they stay on top of that during at least the last 3 days leading into the show, to make it a bit more convenient for them. But that's really, it's helped them with, the whole, like, am I going to be holding water or not? And then for me, it just gives me slightly clearer looks in regards to like what's going on, because I don't have to cut through the edema as much.
Yeah. I'm glad you said the word edema, because there is actually some evidence to suggest that when people have been dieted, especially aggressively, and to get very lean, that edema increases. That's something you will observe in like semi-starved people. And so yeah, it's I think we've gone beyond the 10 years ago kind of overzealous myth busting of, lean, like bodybuilders don't hold water at all, like especially if you're natural. That's not a thing. Like it can be. I think the intervention for it, the degree to which it happens, those are probably what we're wrong. Like we don't need to take an Epsom salt bath or restrict water further. What we need to do is stay hydrated and reduce stress and not be dieting. And it'll take care of itself, and it might take a day or two. So, like Berto was saying, water is tightly regulated, but if you have like edema related to, severe months of dieting, and you're trying to manipulate carbs and all this stuff in one day, and you're super depleted going into it, that's what things tend to fall apart. And I think having that massive to-do checklist where you're manipulating all of the various variables that you might have heard bodybuilders talk about on game day, I think it only exacerbates that. So yeah, a big emphasis that I've had is just decluttering game day. I think that's something that I have tried to do. Some people do like start to fade away just with, missing a meal. You're kind of like Berto, you probably wouldn't go without eating on game day, I'd imagine, and other people who have similar physiology to you. Like for me though, I know like if I looked great last night or even a little spilled last night, I can have a very reasonable breakfast with some like fruit and protein, and then just keep drinking water, and I'll look good at least until like the afternoon, and that's freeing. That's nice. And I think, and physiologically it makes sense too. It takes time to store glycogen, and glycogen doesn't go a whole lot of places unless you really like try to. You burn through it. When you're leaner, it's a little easier for it to get used up because you just don't have as many other sources of fuel available in your body. But yeah, I try to figure out what's the least amount of shit I can manipulate on game day for the person. Yes. And that's where we want to get to. Rather than, I think previously it was like tick, 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 tick. Here's all the things to do on game day, which I think exacerbates stress levels. If I have one cheat code that I would share, it would be that pretty much with everybody, I do try to get them to look just a little spilled in the photos that I sent me the night before. And then on game day, I am actually going a little more conservative. And that is almost like that will proportionately scale to the person, but that's pretty much like 95% of clients. I don't know is that true for you guys?
Yep.
I would agree.
Like you can tell, like if they got a pump up that night, even like they would look tighter. Like that's kind of yeah, they look like a slingshot pulled back sort of look.
Yeah, and sometimes, really, to be honest with you, if I think that they look perfect the night before the show, I'll give them a little bit more to eat. You know,
Exactly.
Just because if they look perfect the night before the show, they're probably not going to wake up perfect. They're especially in Berto's case, Berto's going to wake up flat if he looked perfect, the night before. So yeah, sometimes I'll say, okay, you know what, we look really good, which kind of scares me. So I think I do want you to have a little, bedtime snack, or maybe this one time I do want you kind of getting up, in the middle of the night and getting something in you. Cause it's kind of one of those things where we've got, like you talked about earlier, Eric, we've got a little bit of transit time here. It's not like all this stuff, no matter how quickly digesting it is and quickly absorbed it is there still takes some time to get there, and I think I would rather get that in, kind of at bedtime or in the middle of the night. So we do have time to get that, processed in where we want it. And then a lot of times they do end up looking right like we want them to. And then, of course, you take into consideration the person. Like with Berto, like you said, we would want to give him a good meal, A lot of times folks like Berto that do take a lot of food, they take in a lot of sodium. They're taking between 7 and 10 grams of sodium a day. So maybe we do want that kind of a person to kind of put a little bit of salt on their breakfast, Whereas a lot of the smaller bodybuilders, especially that and I'm not just going to say females, because there's a lot of 120-pound male bodybuilders too. They've been getting by with like 1,200 calories and maybe 2 grams of sodium a day, and we got to be a little bit more conservative with them, and maybe they don't salt their meal, and we kind of take into consideration their particular context. But yeah, I agree with you, Eric. I like them to go to bed just a tiny bit spilled, and we've talked about what that spilled and flat looks like, and I certainly don't have the perfect eye for it. But things that Berto has taught me, have really, really helped. Looking at the thinner muscles, the abs, some of those thin little muscles in the hamstrings, do those stand out? Well, you're probably pretty full, but if they're a little bit blurry, yeah, maybe you are a little bit flat. And you can kind of figure that out on each individual person, as you're going through your prep. But yeah, outside of that, shoot, I just lost it. I was going to say if I could play moderator for a second, I have never really swung for the fences and said, you know what, I want you to drink 1.5 liters of water before bed after we just took in 800 grams of carbohydrates. I've seen these kind of things, and sometimes it does do amazing things to but I've never done that, and so Berto, I kind of want to ask you, have you ever done that? And if you had it actually work out like some of the folks that we've seen have actually had it work out?
No, I think I've never done I think something more similar to what Cliff does. I mean, he gets great results with it, but I've never done that. I think the only way I could do that is if maybe I did it on myself before, or the athlete fully consented that, you know what, the only way I'm going to do well is if I literally swing for the fences. Let's swing for the fences. And it came from a good place where I'm like, okay, this seems like a reasonable plan given the circumstances. But I think I've always, I want predictable, I want predictable, and I want good, steady, slow progress in the right direction. And we talked about the peaking over many weeks. To me, that is the one thing that I think, just from what I've seen, has just trumped any other method. But again, it's not too common. But who knows? In a few years, it might be one of those things where if you are running a peak week, it's you're running you were late week. It might get there in a few years, because it does work that well.
Yeah, I tried that on myself in 2007 when I look back at how much I ate, after prejudging when I knew I wasn't going to place. And I looked a lot bigger at the night show, and then my quad separation was 30% of what it was in prejudging. I still have those pictures. They're hilarious. My avatar until I did my next season on the bodybuilding.com forums was just a picture of me from the waist up hitting a most muscular from that first show. And I was way bigger than I actually did in that shot than from and like the show prior that I did with Berto. The feedback I got from other people when they saw my pictures from that show that I carefully curated not to show, where I totally spilled, were like, "Oh damn, what did you do that last week?" So, yeah, pros and cons. So that's at least what my body says to those big last minute changes. But I'm glad, Brad, you said transit time, and I think transit time is something not a lot of people do, because it's just not the natural way that humans think. Like, we associate things together over two short time courses that may or may not be representative of the time course that things occur. You know, like the economy right now must be affected by what's currently going on. It couldn't be from, years ago or whatever. It's just one random example. But so I was talking about how that load look is very important. That lack of consideration of that transit time or that load look often gets people messed up when they watch what happens to their physique when they go out to eat afterwards. So like, you might have restricted water and then just had a little bit before finals, but kind of been light at prejudging, and then ate a lot of food, and then you go out to eat 2 hours later, you have a lot of food, and you go to the bathroom, you're like, I look amazing. Is that because of the chips and salsa and the burger that you had 30 minutes ago? Or maybe it's because of all the stuff that you did on the day of that is now only hitting you, given the time course. Mm-hmm. And then also, then you wake up the next day and you look bad. Like, maybe that's because of the burger and the nachos, homie.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
You look good for 10 minutes. You look good for 10 minutes, and then you're walking on your feet for a little longer, and then reality
exactly.
hits.
Yeah, and I think just people forget, like, okay, you just ate 3,000 calories. Like, how long does it take to digest that? You know, with your atrophied ass GI tract, that is super slow now. You're going to be pooping that out by like during dinner tomorrow. Like, come on. Yeah. So
if you're lucky,
exactly. So that is something that I have consistently seen, is that people will underdo it or do something funky or delay the effects by manipulating water, go out to eat, drink water, have a lot of sodium, look good, and then shitload for the next competition, and then look bad for a different reason, and then they just like, there's a mystery. So I think that's something just to consider, is that just because you ate it 20 minutes ago is not making a massive difference. Like, if you look great and then you had a Reese's right before you got on stage, that's not why. It's just you have to have a more realistic transit time awareness, I guess.
Yeah, and that's exactly why a lot of times I don't want to see the pictures on your high day, I want to see the pictures from the high day that we had the day before, or I want to see the pictures, whatever it is that I'm trying to accomplish. I'm taking into consideration not what happened that day. I'm taking into consideration what happened the day before, sometimes 2 days before.
Yeah, sometimes.
And I like to put my little copious notes in there and say, there was 3 high days. Then morning of, these pictures happened, if it's in the evening, okay, here's 3 high days. Here's what happened that day. But I like to have the context of what happened the day before and 2 days before in relation to those pictures and how they looked, right there, which you have to make sure you kind of convey that to your athlete too. Because you might tell them, hey, you know what? You look great there. What did you do there? Oh, well, you know what? Today I had this, and this. And I'm like, no, wait, I want you to know. I want to know what you had the day before and 2 days before. And they're like, oh, well, I don't really remember. Yeah. So you kind of convey to them, take those notes. What happened 2 days before the photos that we plan on taking? What happened the day before the photos that we plan on taking? Just those little nuggets of information are going to be pretty helpful. Come peak week and show day and things like that.
Awesome. Berto, anything else you want to add? I think we covered a fair bit of ground here, and I think hopefully we've helped people understand some of the ways we do things. And I think they are conservative, but I think they are effective, and I see as a win-win, because it kind of lowers the chance of having negative outcomes.
And consistent too, yes. Across athletes.
Yeah, no, predictable is good, I think, during peak week, and I think like that's usually. It just doesn't go hand in hand with that very special week in a bodybuilder's life. But you want to explicitly be able to describe and imagine what it is that you're shooting for. like for me, it's like I know I'm full when my abs are full. With you, Eric, it's like, maybe not as much now, but for a while it was like, okay, we want these specific things to happen with the legs. So yeah, rather than like I'm going to do all these things and then like boom, I'm gonna wake up like in a manner that I'll probably never see again until my next show. Like that's just not realistic, and that I've yet to see it happen. Right, we've been doing this for almost 2 decades soon here, and we've yet to really see that work. So yeah, predictability is what you want. It sounds boring, but I think over the long run, it's gonna net you the most, the most W's or the best, most consistent look that you can have, given what you're working with then.
Well said. Any final words, Brad, before we sign off?
No, not really. Like I said, I'm like Berto. I like consistency and predictability. And if through leading up to peak week, we've kind of played around. We've said, you know what, there really was not that much of a difference between this and this. So let's not push too much beyond that. And not throw anything weird. Right there at the end of peak week. Let's do what we've done before, and maybe we can just push just a tiny bit above that, food-wise or like Berto said, water-wise or whatever. But, let's keep it consistent so that, the put me in coach happens right there on show day.
Absolutely. Well, gentlemen, I appreciate all the insights. Hopefully this has been helpful to everyone listening and get you a little idea of what the heck are we even shooting at, so you know how to hit that target. And thank you for listening, and we will catch you next time on the 3DMJ podcast. What's going on, 3DMJers? Eric Helms here. Thanks for listening to our podcast. I just want to take a second to tell you about MASS, Monthly Applications in Strength Sport. This is a monthly research review that I put out with Greg Nuckols, Dr. Mike Zerdos, and Dr. Eric Trexler. We cover the most up-to-date, peer-reviewed research in the world of strength and physique sport that's directly relevant to your practice as a coach or athlete. We provide our reviews in written format, but also, since you enjoy our podcast, audio roundtable reviews where we discuss the research in depth. Finally, we also do video concept reviews where we cover a broader topic in video format for your learning. For fitness professionals, you can take quizzes on MASS content and earn continuing education credits in most of the biggest certifying bodies in the fitness industry. If you want to sign up and get a subscription, head over to 3dmusclejourney.com and click on the Products tab. Thank you for your time, and thank you for listening.